us know. All right, so it's time to start the event with the talk part of the event with the keynote we have today. We have Dr. Matilde Sánchez-Peña coming from University of Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, I should say. My Spanish accent comes every time I say that word. We met in FIE in Frontiers in Education. I think it was 2016, my first conference as a PhD student. And I was so glad, as I was mentioning before, I'm interested in certain topics. I find this session and this speaker that it's super approachable and we can have this kind of mentoring relationship and helping me see how can you get into these topics. And then Matilde has moved on to talk about or to work on topics such as well-being, has a fantastic paper on positionality, and all these topics I thought were a fantastic overview for what we're gonna do here in this event. I know she recently got a Best Paper Award, so now that I've said it, she has to say it later. And yes, very glad that you're here and the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's okay. Good. It's a pleasure to be here today, definitely. This event, I think it's one of a kind. I realized that it's kind of like a kind of a thing for University of Uppsala, which I think is great. But I totally see, I have a vision that this is the starting of a larger movement in terms of saying, humanization of educational spaces need to happen soon. And we're going to do it together, So I am really humble to offer this keynote. And I hope that the thoughts that I will be sharing with you today will provide some food for thought, right? That's the intention of a keynote. So hopefully we start the event with the right foot. I want also to thank the organizers, right, for having me. Preparing this talk has brought a lot of momentum for me and my research and my intellectual development. So it's a lot of synergies happening, and definitely it's exciting time for me as an assistant professor. So I can wait, imagining together new research adventures potentially here with the people in the room and the people online, and right. So now to me, right? Like, where is it? Oh, here. This way. So my name is Matilde Sánchez-Peña, and I'm an assistant professor of engineering education at University of Buffalo, as Virginia said. Yes, we met a long time ago, and yes, I have been exploring in different spaces of research. I'm going to be talking about them in a minute. Yes, I got an award and I got a couple of grants working on mental health, working on systemic change in terms of broadening participation. So of course, I will be happy to talk about those to more detail, but I'm going to give you the highlights in here. So this is the me, but the kind of me that you will see if you Google me, if you check my CV, whatever, right? It's whatever I present to my students when I start class in UV, because of course that is relevant information somehow, right? But this is not what I want to talk to you about, but it's more about this. I'm also a mom, a partner, a daughter, a sister, an aunt, actually a great aunt already. You'll be surprised. And I'm also an immigrant, women of color, working in a US institution, which has a lot to do with how I see the world. So all of these intersections of my identity matter for how I see my work and the impact that they can have, right? So those are the things that matter to me, right? It's the whole package, the whole enchilada. And this is the amazing team that accompanied me in my adventures, right? My research lab is called the Dare to Care Lab. It's really long, but we pay attention to how do we assess how we are doing in engineering education and computing too, right? Because we cannot exclude each other. But these wonderful people help me kind of like walk the line, right? If I'm saying that I dare to care, what does it mean in everything I do? What does it mean in mentoring my postdoc? What does it mean in mentoring my undergraduate researchers, my graduate researchers? And I will remove the my because they are not mine. That I hate that, you know, we put that into team somehow. But they help me grow. And that's why they should be here. Because like a lot of the things that I will share today, of course, were prepared through these wonderful productive relationships that we have. So the research that we have in our lab has to do with care, as I mentioned, right? So we have three particular threads, and I like to call it the care of the self, the care about others, and the care about the world. In the first thread, which is the care about the self, we do explore what about well-being, what about cultures of health in educational spaces, right? And this is where I have a project on mental health in engineering. And care about others has to do with institutional diversity, right? Like it doesn't matter what your positionality is in an institution, it does matter that you actually are part of the change. The positive change that we all know we need in institutions across the world. So in that space, I do research about advancement of women faculty and how do we actually assess that movement forward through complex system theories and methods, trying to understand those dynamics from a more social perspective using engineering tools, right? And excuse me, the third thread, which is about caring about the world, is of course, has to do of course with sustainability, social responsibility. We know that our students care more about this, but are we really serving their intentions, their goals? We know that the world needs it, but are we supporting their development on that front? Research has shown that we actually do a poor job and we go backwards, right? And that students actually lose that interest on being socially responsible, on support sustainability, and you know, looking at problems from a socio-technical perspective rather than only purely technical, right? So that is the three threads of my research lab. And I'm gonna talk about mainly the results from this first leg because it matters for the topic today. And it's the type of the things that I'm mentioning, you know, has made a synergy like these days. The paper award that Virginia was mentioning is in the Division of Educational Research Methods of the American Society of Engineering Education, and was the first piece of results from this mental health project. And especially because we paid attention to what elements of the culture are really, really bothering or connecting with the mental health crisis in academic spaces. So the challenge that we have today together, I believe, are these two questions. What are the barriers to humanizing computing and engineering education? And how do we start breaking such barriers, right? I think we are all together here because we have that interest. We all have identified that, yes, we need to pay attention to this, but how do we start? It is not an easy equation. So I'm going to be offering you insights from my research and proposals, potential proposals in terms of steps forward that we can take together to start that change. So the way that I see computer and engineering cultures, right? I know this diagram is kind of like oversimplistic, but it's intended to be general in a sense, right? So in the center, we have students and faculty, right? We know that those relationships matter and matter a lot. And they take place within spaces, including like which are framed under institutions, right? And those institutions are located within societies. And these lines are dotted because we know that those institutions interact with society, and societies in between each other interact as well, right? No society is, I call it like, if we're referring to society, like geographical societies, none of the societies are islands, right? So from these, we know that in terms of the interactions that happen in between faculty and students, there is a lot of norms that are transferred, right, in day-to-day simple interactions. Many of them are known as the hidden curricula, right, that we actually intentionally pass along, right? Institutions themselves have actually the leeway, or I would say the space of action in terms of policies and structures that they can establish to facilitate or improve those interactions, right? And of course, the societies where they are embedded, where institutions are embedded, also have structural dynamics and contextual and time restrictions, right? So it's not the same, you know, Sweden in the 1900s than Sweden right now, right? So what we do and how we do it, because we are in computer and engineering education context, that is what is culture, right? That is what we need to unpack further, right? Something that bothered me consistently when I was, you know, trying to get my projects off the ground, it was like, yes, it's culture, it's how we do things and why we do them, etc. But we haven't pointed at the actual, like, how does it look? In order to address a problem, you need to name it, right? And like, if we just keep saying culture, 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 it's like, yes, but where do we start, right? So that was the part that, you know, I took firsthand as a challenge for this project. And this is how it moved forward. So the question that we try to address first with this first year of data that we have is that what are the cultural elements that make computing and engineering education different? And these results come from a qualitative research project with 34 students. But these results really resonate with the quantitative results that we got from a survey from more than 1,000 students in 2 institutions. So one of the things, and actually getting back to the, to the diagram, is that what we are also trying to tackle, right, is because cultures have been studied from the institutional perspective, right? Like, and organizations have a say in terms of how the culture will be. But what we are actually looking or seeking is to identify what is that culture that is here in Uppsala, but is also there in Buffalo and in Purdue and in Mexico, and that characterize somebody that is in computer science, in engineering, that actually is, you know, like that type of piece of indoctrination almost, that we just infuse in our beings as we move towards our computer and engineering education, right? So in a sense, it's somewhat context dependent, but not really. It's more field dependent. So it's the essence that we are trying to shoot for. So with that in mind, what we asked these students were, what differentiates you from others, from other mayors, from other fields? What do you think makes you different? And what they come up with were these themes. So the first one was problem solving and efficiency, okay? I'm a problem solver and I do things efficiently, you know? Excuse me. And, you know, they took pride on that, deep pride. From there, the communication conundrum, I call it, because there was consistent reference to saying communication is essential for the type of work that computer scientists and engineers do, but we are not good at it. And that's it, you know? That's kind of like the conundrum that we just get okay to live with, period. The third part was that they recognize that during their training, like, oh, collaboration is essential. Yes, we need to work in teams, but the competition is fierce. I live in a constant status of stress because I see that, you know, my peer has just got the job at Google and I feel inadequate, right? So I put them all like together because, of course, competition doesn't go hand in hand with collaboration. They clash. And from there, of course, hard work and the requiring time and focus, right? Which of course we know it, right? Like, yes, we are asking about all these things, but it's what you just need to do, right? Type of thing. So they found a lot of, challenges from living from that type of restriction whatsoever. But of course, we know that it leads to the meritocracy of difficulty, right? Like, oh, I earned this. This is my badge of honor. I suffered, and you should too, first year, you know. So, and finally, of course, non-surprisingly, whiteness and masculinity in these spaces and how they hurt those that don't conform this status, right? So the following up question is, of course, how directly it hinders the student ability to procure their well-being, right? So I am not showing exact quotes. These are papers in the processing. So I'm like, I'm just gonna talk about the big things because I also have other things that, hopefully will complement and get us all excited at the end, right? So problem solving and efficiency, right? Is students say, I don't have, if I'm an engineer or computer scientist, I need to be the problem solver. So if I have a mental health problem or a well-being problem, I better fix it myself. So there is no space for trying to understand the problem otherwise. I'm a problem solver. This is my responsibility. And using my time into something like this, it's not efficient. So that itself is like, okay, one of the points that, how do we start reshaping this in order to flip the coin? From there, the communication conundrum, right? So we suck at communicating, right? But all of the students that referred to saying like, no, actually I was able to navigate my mental health issues or wellness issues is because I actually was able to communicate those and express that efficiently or develop these networks that were critical for me to navigate those things. If we don't have students that communicate efficiently or have this capacity to talk to each other and start those efficient networks or valuable networks, right? How do we expect them to navigate these things, right? So we need to start challenging the persistent narrative, like, oh, we're bad at it, never mind, right? And of course, the collaboration versus the competition element, really like the quotes I have like really are along the lines of like, yes, I know I need to collaborate, but when you're putting me in a group and this group is really just bragging about the things that they have done, it just doesn't work, right? This equation is detrimental to everybody's well-being, right? And of course, it favors the ones that are on top or are perceived as being on top, right? And is this perception or this assumption that there should be one winner. But we know that there's a ton of need for these professionals. Actually, chances are that all of them are going to have, like most likely than not, all of them are going to have a job at the end. Do we actually need that cruel competition in the meantime? So from there, the hard work, the requiring time of focus and everything, it's like competing interests, right? They literally said, I cannot handle something like this. If I identify that I have a mental health issue or whatever, I just can't. I either put time into making an appointment with a specialist or whatever, or I study for my exam in 2 days. Or I keep working towards my homework due tomorrow or whatever, because my schedule is wake up and work and keep working all day, go to bed. So kind of like in a cruel type of, this is the drill. And I know I signed up for this and that's it. And of course, whiteness and masculinity, a lot of the females in this sample were referring to these, really serious episodes in terms of saying, it might not be that I had a one-on-one kind of like horrible experience, right? But being in that big room and being the only one of 3, it's already the hit. I already don't want to enter to that classroom. Or I don't even have the energy to connect with the other 2. We already know that it's too much. So it is bigger than we believe. And it has connections deeper to the issues that we're trying to fix than we have been able to recognize. In terms of whiteness, some students of color also were referring to the fact like, well, I actually cannot even pay attention to mental health because mental health itself is white. Like it's an issue that only white people can pay attention to. And like the elements or are making assumptions about how it actually is, and it's based in whiteness. So I cannot even identify myself with going and finding help for this type of issues. So serious things, of course. Many of these things have been reported before in the literature, of course. Whiteness and masculinity, like, yes, we know it. The stress culture, right, has been reported before. But these conundrums in terms of like, or these trying to, like competition of, the skill and the intention, it's something that I believe will bring value to the conversation. So potential alternatives, right? So if these are the 5 identified challenges, right, how do we start tackling it? So here's what I propose. So we know that problem solving has traditionally been purely technical, right? That the social part of the socio-technical element has been removed for a while, and we haven't paid attention enough. Like even like one recent small paper that we conducted, right? Like we actually asked the students, so which challenges you want to solve in the world? Which problems, right? And it's still 24% of them were referring just to technical stuff for the sake of technical stuff. Like I want to go, I want to do aerospace stuff because it's cool. It's technical, period, right? And many of them made the connection like, well, we're going to help taking the people to Mars, like, sure. But many of them were just for the sake of it, right? The technical for the technical. So we still have this challenge of how do we bring it back and say, hey, the problems you're solving are not only technical, they're socio-technical. And the technical part, we have been doing great, but we need to do a better job with that social part and help. And that could be a good connection to say, you know what, the issue that you're having and that you're trying to solve by yourself is still social. And you can, yes, you can still trying to solve it by yourself, but most likely you're going to have a better understanding of its complete picture, right? Because it's not something that you can just tackle and say like, oh, I have it now and tomorrow I don't. So from there, the communication conundrum, right? Like people have been like making calls about saying like, let's reshape what is called soft skills, right? Because they are not soft skills. They are essential. They are essential to engineering and computer science work. So why do we keep calling them? Why do we keep giving them their bad rep that we know is limiting their growth, right? So the part between collaboration and competition, I am proposing, like, I don't think, I mean, I'm not a proponent of fierce competition, but I know that there is many people that say like, well, competition is still good, right? Like, well, sports and everything, it's healthy, it's, but there is this definition that I found for in a particular book about positive and negative competition, and this is the point. We need to reframe competition within engineering education and computer science education spaces to be positive, right? There is enough, and actually it's tied to a belief of abundance, or as there is enough for everyone, right? Like, I know there is need for these professionals. They're gonna have a job at the end. They don't need to kill each other. They actually can compete together to improve their own selves in a constant basis and achieve together greatness. We don't need a space that kills souls. And then at the end, it's like, forget it, I'm out. So in the stress culture, of course, we haven't been able to eradicate without culture. And I know it's a difficult nut to crack, but we need to keep going. We need to keep trying, right? These without culture can be replaced by growth mindsets, by really bringing the idea of saying, you know what? Yes, it's okay. You didn't have AP computer science. You didn't have AP calculus. There is still a place for you, and you focus on your game and move forward towards the goal. And of course, we have a ton of evidence-based practices that haven't been widely implemented or really realized their potential. So, and of course, for whiteness and masculinity, we have a ton of work, a ton of work. And I believe some of the commentary at the end will definitely cater to that. So I will not dive deeper because now I go for the faculty perspective, right? So we conducted our study on faculty. And what we asked was, how did faculty came to realize the link between student well-being and academic success? We interviewed, I think, 14 faculty. And I was saying to somebody, like, you know, self-selected, of course. I'm still trying to convince those that believe in without culture to talk to me. But until then, this is what we got. So how they come to, how they realize this thing? They either had undergraduate experiences where they say, like, you know what? I realized that when I took a legit break, I could do better work, right? So I just kept doing that practice, or I just kept you know, working out in a regular basis, you know? So I learned how to take care of myself, and I just kept doing it. And now that I'm a faculty, I'm actually showing my students, like, hey, remember to take a break, remember to do this, remember to do that, right? Others in their graduate experience had these firsthand experiences, right? Like, oh, I had my mental health issues. Not a surprise, right? We know that statistics is really, really sobering on that front. Or close experiences, right? But they also had role models. Some of the faculty that they had as advisors or mentors, like, were really good at saying, you know what? After 5, I don't answer any email. I'll see you tomorrow, right? Or things like those. So they recognize that part really clearly. And then there were a handful that say, like, well, I know everything was fine. Undergraduate experiences, faculty experience. Sorry, undergraduate and graduate. But when I became a faculty, then things went south. I had my own challenges, or my students had a challenge, or my kid had a challenge. And I had to face the thing that, yes, it exists. Yes, it's legit. Yes, we need to pay attention to it. So from there, our next question was, okay, what these people actually do to support the well-being of their students? And this is what they came up with. First, having and reminding resources, right? Like, I have my list of things, and if they come to me, I just gotta give the list, right? The magic list. But some of them also went all the way to say, like, you know, I discussed this in my class, or at least I mentioned it, right? And if they come to me, I'm gonna impart my wisdom and I'm gonna help them, right? Others were really intentional about, you know, specific teaching and advising practices that knew that were inclusive or, you know, supportive of the students. But there were these 2 elements that were critical to the thing. And one of them was, like, they view themselves, like, all these pieces, they view themselves as support, you know, kind of like, I am here to help the student. That is my function, right? And some of them also paid attention to, you know, I make the effort to be a human in the classroom, but this is with the goal of being able to relate to students and help them, right? So from here, what I get is that something is missing, because faculty is usually, or I believe that institutions endorse this in terms of saying, you know what? Yes, faculty is your work. Catch them, pay attention, like suicidal prevention, et cetera. And if something goes wrong, it's like, oh, it was my fault, right? Oh, of course, I don't hope that for anybody. But we internalize this as it's our work, it's faculty work. And we know that faculty work is already busy enough. It's heavy work. And that we cannot pour from empty basins, right? Or empty cups, is that the saying? So the thing that I believe wasn't here is that they don't see themselves as role models. There is a lot, I mean, and of course, like, especially the research that we're going to be hearing about tomorrow, right? There is a lot that you can do by being a positive role model with your well-being yourself. But are we paying attention to actually having happy, healthy lives as faculty and model that to students? I would dare to say that not necessarily, right? And of course, we need to pay extra attention to the fact that we are under institutional structures with particular restrictions, right? Which brings us to a systemic view that I'm going to be talking in a minute. But we cannot keep endorsing that view or that responsibility of saying, nope, this is my job and I'm going to do extra and more and more and more. I know we are all passionate about it. We all care about our students, but we cannot sacrifice ourselves in the process. So the barriers that these faculty perceive to support their students' well-being were these three. So first of all, being taken advantage of, right? Like, oh, I'm just gonna give too much and then they just gonna take advantage of me, right? To this, I would actually say, you know, in my personal view, I prefer to do a type 2 error than a type 1. You know, if I can do something, I'll just do it. And if, you know, the intention or whatever is different, it's not in my conscience, right? But anyway, women of color were concerned that caring jeopardized their legitimacy and made students respect them less. It was only women of color that talked about this. And of course, literature said that actually women of color need to be like super hyper aware of all those things anyway. So let alone bringing more care, right? And finally, the fear that doing this work will be seen as radical within their departments or with their colleagues. So it's sure not hopeful, right? Like it's kind of like a pollen picture. Not surprising, but I think spaces like this is where we need to start thinking about how do we make the radical normal? So this is what I propose. Replace the support-based view to a role modeling view. You know, yes, how does it look? An educational space where I am so happy that I can help my students, that I'm so healthy, that they also say, you know what, yes, after 5 p.m., let's just go take a break, right? And, you know, challenge the status quo of saying, this is how things are being done, and this is the way they need to keep happening, right? Bringing your humanity in the classroom needs to start with your own well-being, right? The bringing your humanity is not only for being this lifeline for somebody, but is for actually paying attention to yourself as a human too, you know? Humanizing others starts by humanizing yourself. Again, the competition part, I believe, helps on this part of being taken advantage of, right? Because this culture of competition that we have, right? And well, of course, that also fits with the whiteness and maleness. I just didn't put it there. But the fact that it was only women of color that came up with this, right? So how do we try to advance that and saying, you know, that element of somebody feeling inadequate or the legitimate side, yes, it's not what we do here. Also, of course, making a space for care, making a space for emotions, right? Which, of course, will change the narrative in terms of saying, you know what? Yes, women have emotions and care and everything, so do men. And it's okay. And we won't be attaching value judgments to say, oh, they care too much because there should be something that they are not, you know, suitable for. And I found this concept of communities of meaning, you know, and I think it fit really well with what we are doing right now. So communities of meaning go beyond communities of practice. It shoots more for self-actualization, self-realization. The value comes from being together and think about solving these particular elements in a different way, or doing something that really moves us as humans and brings our self-actualization collectively. So that's what I propose, that if we want to start changing the culture from inside, we need to start creating communities of meaning everywhere we're at. And of course, that means start identifying each other and start trying to change the narratives that happen with it. So, oh yeah, that was a good reference that I used for the well-being part. If you haven't been familiar with it, I think it's a great statement about, you know what? Yes, as faculty, we need rest. We're humans. We take care of ourselves. So starting with ourselves, that is the step forward I propose. I never paid attention to what my students were paying attention. But it happens that leaving at 3 p.m. to pick up my kid and say, forget about work after this, I'll get back tomorrow at whatever morning, really early morning time. It does send a signal, you know, that I have my boundaries and they are learning it. I am being the role model that I didn't even think of. And it wasn't intentional. I was just doing it for myself. So while this taking care of myself has always had this bad rep, like, oh, you're so selfish, right? It has this powerful effect. And we need to be free enough to enact it. And okay, so now to the system perspective. And I'm aware of the time. I think we're okay. Good. So here's what I locate the different things that were found, right? So there is 4 elements about the engineering. How do we do things? And how do we do things? And then elements, of course, that institutions can pay attention to, right? Like, for example, there is a ton that has been tried to be done on the space of protecting faculty from marginalized identities to actually do the things they do and they care, right? But there's still a lot to do. And of course, the fact that sexism, racism, ageism, ableism, and any other isms are still alive and thriving in all societies, right? And yes, we have advances in some particular societies, but if you think your society is perfect, you haven't looked deep enough. You haven't asked the correct people. So I am putting it there, of course, in the middle of the society and institutions, because we know that institutions are not islands. Like, it's not like, oh, I just like sign off from whatever is going outside and the institution is perfect. It's not. All of those systemic elements that the society is dealing with go directly to your institution. And, you know, all of these things also like go into the practice of the engineers that go into the society, right? So if we address that, we will be pouring a good lifeline into society, right? But we need to address these elements in order to make sure that the system gets improved somehow, right? So at this point, I need to invite you to reflect on where are you located? You are within a society. You are most likely within an institution, right? You have a role, right? So if you're still a student, you have a lot of vulnerability, right? You are in a position of vulnerability. If you are faculty, depending on your rank, you have another level of vulnerability, right? Different levels of vulnerability, etc. If you're in a leadership position, this is way different, right? So we need to really identify where are we located. And in your society, right? Being able to name things as they are in order to say, you know what, this is my intersectionality and how it plays along in the places where I am either a decision maker, or I could be an ally, or I'm in a disadvantage and I need an ally. So, yep, this is the next step. My good friend and colleague, Dr. Kristen Moore, made this nice illustration. You know, it actually illustrates really nicely how the intersectionality, your intersectionality between your positionality and privilege needs to be identified in order to see where power is, right? So all your identities most likely will not change through time, right? So they are most likely defined, but our positionality actually shifts according to the time and location that you share, right? If I'm in my classroom with grad students, it's different than if I'm in my classroom with undergrads. And if I'm in a meeting room with my colleagues in the department, right? Or if I'm with the dean in the room, my positionality changes. The power I hold changes. And we need to pay attention to how those things change in order to see what is the role, how much power do we have, and if somebody doesn't have power and I do have it, how do I share it? So we need to pay attention to those things. If you are vulnerable, how you identify allies and work with them. If you hold power, how do we share it and empower those that need it? So that is positionality of change. But we need to do a lot of work in terms of actually identifying both, like everything, right? Like your like fixed intersectionality, as well as your changing and chameleonic positionality according to time and space. So this is the last part, and I hope we have the time for an exercise. Because what I propose today is to follow more or less what Mike Robbins in this book really nicely set up in terms of saying authenticity is essential for effective relationships, and especially working relationships, right? And I'm talking about working relationships because, well, engineering culture is a lot of working relationships, right? Not that we cannot bring ourselves, like, yeah, it's kind of like what I did at the beginning. I wrote myself because it matters for me to connect with you all. right? But he has this spectrum, you know, funny, through honest, through authentic. And here I'm gonna take my notes because, you know, there is this understanding of saying, you can, in order to establish relationships, right? You can be phony, like, oh, how you doing, right? Like, we don't really stop and talk about how we're doing. Like, it's just a cultural normal. Everybody does it, right? Or I am sometimes evading, yes, evading a conflict, right? And I just go with the flow, right? And I don't check the actual reality of how I feel or who I am in a particular space, or addressing elements that need to be addressed, right? Or sometimes there is decision making and I'm disagreeing, but really don't want conflict. So like, whatever, right? So that's being phony, right? Avoiding conflict, avoiding difficult conversations, right? And then going through the honest spectrum is like, yes, you can say things and you can take risks, but it's still tries to manage those saying like, how do I do it right? How am I honest, but I still tell you in the nicest way and I don't bother your feelings, you know? But then a lot of that is actually involved on the fact that we start with the assumption that a lot of the ideas that we bring to the table are right. Self-righteousness. So authenticity is actually about bring your honesty, but don't make the assumption that you have all the right answers, and make yourself vulnerable. And that brings value, and that makes you authentic. And it's a space where you can grow and help others grow, and, you know, pretty much make a space for growing together. And that's what I'm proposing for today. That we're gonna grow together today a bit or a lot, right? By starting with these honest conversations where we put away our self-righteousness and invite vulnerability. So that is the thing, because when it comes to equity and inclusion and all that stuff, right, it's really easy to say, oh, I don't want to get it wrong, right? But you better get it wrong than not try. Because if you get it wrong, you're going to learn how it's better, or how could it be better, or we can visualize together, right? While if you just hinder yourself by, oh no, like it's something that I can handle, then we are handicapped from the very beginning. So the activity that I propose for today are based on Robin's activity called lowering the waterline of the iceberg. I have modified it a little bit to keep it in a good note. But excuse me. These were my preferred quotes of the book, of course, and I'll let you read it. Vulnerability creates connection. And I think that's what we want today. But beyond today, that's what we want in educational spaces for real learning to happen. That we will potentiate our learners' capacities by bringing this vulnerability to the classrooms and inviting them vulnerabilities as well, right? So the activity is about, I think everybody should, like, most likely everybody's familiar with the iceberg thing, right? Like there is something that you see on top, right? Like you see my assigned sex, or my, like, because of the indicators that I have, et cetera, et cetera. But there are many things that are underneath and you probably didn't see, right? Some of them I show you at the very beginning, but there's a ton that we cannot see of each other. We just see the tip of the iceberg in the class, in this group, right? So the activity is about, think of an episode when you cared about someone in an academic context, okay? And it can be intentionally or not. Like we can actually find a lot of examples where like, oh, I did something nice and I didn't even realize, but you realized it, cool, you know? So think about what was the outcome and how was it worth it? You know, was it a good outcome, a negative outcome, whatever, you know, like here's the thing, like that is a part where, you know, not everything is perfect and it's fine because we're trying to learn to be vulnerable together. So were there any elements of your positionality and vulnerability involved into this episode? And then let's share it with the peer and open to the group for whoever is interested on it. I have my backup example just in case you're not into it. So let's give it just a minute to think and then we pair.